This is 9/11, 10 years after. From WMAL and the museum, where history lives. Here is Torie Clarke.
With us is James Carafano, Homeland Security expert, and he's the director of the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Where were you on 9/11, and what was going through your head on that day?
Well, I was actually, I was still in the Army then. I was in the Army for 25 years, and my last tour was at the National Defense University, and I'd actually just left the Pentagon a year or so before, and I was actually at the National Archives looking for photos for an article for Joint Force Quarterly. It's a journal that Colin Powell started when he was chairman.
Right. What was the article about at the time?
I have no idea. It must have been something to do with history because I was at the archives.
Right.
I was looking. It was actually one of my favorite things to do because they have some great old photo archives there at the National Archives, which is way out in College Park. And I remember I was actually taking a break and I was down in the cafeteria and they said, well, a plane just went into the World Trade Center, and the first thing that went through my head was when a plane hit the Empire State Building back in I think it was the 30s, and I thought, these things happen.
I think that was the first reaction of a lot of people. Oh, yeah. It's a weather plane or a little commuter plane or something.
And then, of course, then they said, well, there's a second plane hit the building, and we're closing the archives, and it's a terrorist attack. And I'm going, well, do you really think they're going to fly a plane in the National Archives? And, are we all safe for kind of running around, scurrying around Washington, D.C., or would we be just, kind of better off kind of staying where we were? So I actually thought that was a pretty dumb move on their part. But anyway, they kind of kicked me out the door, and I kind of worked my way home, and then I found out about the Pentagon and everything else. But you wouldn't believe the number of phone calls I got from friends and everybody else because people who were thinking I was still working in the Pentagon were worried.
Sure.
Or, people didn't know where I was, and I'd left National Defense University, and we used to go over the Pentagon a lot because we work with the Joint Staff and everything, so people thought I was there. So.
And with phones going in and out, one of the things I experienced at the time is so many people from around the country were trying to reach their friends and relatives in D.C. and couldn't because the phones weren't working. Cell phones were out. Landlines even went in and out. So that added to the confusion, I think, for a lot of people.
And, at the time, I actually had no idea that was going to be, in a sense, the rest of my life. We actually did a lot of work on Homeland Security and terrorism at Joint Force Quarterly. One of the great things about the journal was it was designed to kind of get officers to think creatively about the future, and we had very little interference, and we could write about anything we wanted to, and so Homeland Security and terrorism were issues that we just kind of thought were important, and so we'd actually been working on these things, but I had no idea because I retired I guess a year later, and because I'd done something at Homeland Security. Back then, it didn't take much to be a Homeland Security expert. If you could spell the word, pretty much
right.
You were at the top.
You were in a small crowd.
So I wound up in the think tank community, and we've been doing that ever since. And I must say, in all credit to Heritage, there are a lot of what I call 9/11 patriots, and kind of like the Sunshine Patriot. Is every think tank in Washington wanted to do something on Homeland Security after 9/11, but very few actually stayed in the business in a serious way. And to Heritage's credit, well, first of all, they'd actually started looking at this issue in August. Maybe
right.
They did something. And they did one of the first major counterterrorism, Homeland Security terrorism reports by Ed Meese and then Jerry Bremer, long before he went to Iraq. And they stood up a Homeland Security element at Heritage, and they kept it in place ever since, and it's probably now I would argue probably the largest and certainly the most productive. I mean, we have literally generated hundreds of reports on Homeland Security since 9/11, and we were, I think, influential in many different ways. When Secretary Chertoff first came in and did the reorganization of Homeland Security, that was of the Homeland Security Department, that was based on a report that we had done with the Center for Strategic and International Studies. We started the campaign to get rid of the color-coded terror alert system. We started the campaign on visa waiver reform and using that as a way to increase security and get more information, but still make travel more helpful. So we've been doing this stuff a long time, and I mean, I've been all over the world. I mean, I've been on the Mexican border several times. I've been to other countries around the world. We've got analysts who have been in Afghanistan and Pakistan and Iraq and every place else. So
it's a very comprehensive look.
Right. And to the credit of, again, they from the beginning they said, look, we're going to be strategic about this because terrorism is not improvised explosive devices or domestic radicalization or some guy in Yemen. Terrorism is all these things: security, freedom, liberty, promoting commerce and trade, stopping terrorists before they. All these things go, public diplomacy, all these things go together. And so from the beginning, our program has been very, very comprehensive and strategic in its outlook. And I've been very proud to be part of it. But it sure has made us busy.
Right. Well, let me ask you something that I hope gets to thinking pre-9/11 and thinking post-9/11. And I remember when it happened, a lot of people said, oh, this is just like Pearl Harbor. We never expected it. It came out of the blue. And the more time I spent on it, the more people I talked to, the more I realized this is also true about Pearl Harbor. It wasn't that it was unthinkable or even that people hadn't said something bad like this could happen on U.S. territory. It was that it was just considered so unlikely that people didn't really focus on it. Yeah. A, is that true? And B, do we think differently now?
Well, of course, the Pearl Harbor analogy is actually very good. We knew the Japanese wanted to attack Pearl Harbor. I mean, we knew that was a central part of their strategy, and what caught us off guard is we were kind of buying time, hoping to ramp up and make that impossible before it happened. The timing was really a surprise, and because Americans generally hadn't been focusing on us, it was a surprise. 80% of Americans were the day before Pearl Harbor were completely against U.S. involvement in World War II. It was the same thing about terrorism. If you look at the number of terrorism hearings there were in the 1980s, I mean, it was huge. And, of course, we had the Hart-Rubin Commission come out just months before saying Americans were going to die a large number from terrorism. What the problem is we actually had done a pretty good job combating terrorism, but that was because we were focused on state-sponsored terrorism. If you look at the number of terrorist attacks against the United States, and we actually have data on this at our website, heritage.org, 40 years of terrorism trends go back to the 1960s. It peaks in the late 1980s because the state sponsorship of terrorism largely coming from the Russians. And then, of course, with the collapse of the Russians, the number of terrorism attacks just plummets. But what's not seen in that kind of continuous downward trend, and where we thought it's okay to treat terrorism just as one of many things we ought to worry about, was all the organization from Al-Qaeda that was going on behind the scenes, which some people had recognized and spotted and were pointing to, but was just generally not discussed. And of course, we had information on all of this. People trying to fly airplanes into buildings. There was a Paris plot, so we knew about that.
Right.
The guy in Seattle with the information in his computer about getting pilot training. So it was there. I could go through about a dozen terrible, horrible things that when they happen, everybody will say, "Oh my God, it's the new Pearl Harbor. Nobody thought about this." And then, the people that look, I mean, this is not what Americans do.
Right.
They're trying to pay their bills, right? They're not sitting around trying to think of all the terrible, horrible things that can happen in the world. But
right. When I first went to the Pentagon, which was the very early part of 2001, and a lot of people, Secretary Rumsfeld, Paul Wolfowitz, lots of people, senior military, senior civilians were saying, we have to dramatically change the way we run the military. And it's less likely that we're going to have conventional wars. It's more likely we're going to have these terrorist attacks. Asymmetrical was the big word back then.
Right.
And they went on and on about the importance of this. And I could often, and did often, raise my hand and say, guys, I'm the closest thing to a real American you have around here, an average person. And I said, from my perspective and my relatives' perspective outside of Pittsburgh, we've had largely relative peace and prosperity for the last 10 years. We had the Balkans, but that does not hit home for my relative in Pittsburgh trying to pay his bills. And so there was very little public awareness of what was building and what was happening over those years. So I think that's one of the reasons it was such a shock, not for people like you, but for my relatives in Pittsburgh.
Well, I mean, this is the way it always works, is, the enemy gets a vote. And the enemy's always going to want to do the things that you're not prepared to deal with. So you're always in this situation where what you should be doing is trying to preempt them and and when they come up with new and creative ways to come after you, kind of cut off that avenue before it ever becomes a real threat. Now, of course, when you do that successfully, people never hear about it.
Right.
Don't pay attention to it. So people only hear about it when you fail. But the lesson learned isn't, we have to change everything we do because this is the wave of the future, because as soon as you do that, the enemy's going to do something else. And I hear all these people say, we'll never fight another conventional war. Well, I heard that before World War II. I heard it before Korea. I heard it before Vietnam. And I heard it before Iraq. So, and I'm sure I'll hear it again, right? And the answer is, as soon as you prepare not to fight a conventional war, that's when one will jump on you. So the lesson of 9/11 is, recognize that the enemy gets a vote. I got to tell you, the administration's counterterrorism strategy now, which is basically, the war terrorism's over, and we just have to kill a couple of, dozen Al-Qaeda guys, that this is a replay of the strategy in the 1990s, which got us here.
Mm-hmm. So how have we improved? I get a sense from what you just said, how we have not improved since 9/11, but how have we improved? On the national security side of things, how have we improved in terms of how we deal with these sorts of threats?
Well, people say, are we safer after 9/11? And the answer is, you bet. The statistical evidence points to that. If you actually look at terrorism attacks, both against the United States at home and overseas, they go up after 9/11 because the terrorists are on the offensive. But then there's a dramatic drop-off that starts in 2005, and it starts to go down again. And what that drop-off reflects is everything we've been doing both at seas, at home, and overseas to combat terrorism. And so you can demonstrably see the effects of Homeland Security and counterterrorism taking root after 2005. So, people want metrics. You just look at the numbers. It's there. There have been over 40 terrorist plots aimed at the United States since 9/11 that have been thwarted. That, to me, is also evidence that what we're doing is working. Now, the question is what is working? And what has worked is two things. Really, one is going over there and getting them. I know it sounds trite to say, get them over there, otherwise they're going to come and fight them over here, but it's really, really true. Going out and actively disrupting the terrorist networks, and that includes operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, have really paid big dividends. If you look at the number of foiled terrorist plots in the United States, at least half of them were from an individual who went to an overseas training camp, worked with somebody in overseas training camp, or tried to get to training camp. So those sanctuaries, those overseas bases, that's important. And taking that down has made a significant difference. And, of course, the other thing that's really made a huge difference is effective counterterrorism operations, going out and collecting the intelligence, doing the information sharing, taking out the leaders, disrupting the networks, disrupting the operations, cutting off the sources of funding, cutting off the sources of recruiting. And by every demonstrable measure, it has been successful. Transnationally, Al-Qaeda's reputation in the Islamic world has declined significantly. America is not more popular, but the important thing is neither is Al-Qaeda. Their capacity to organize major operations has declined significantly. Their capacity to pull disparate groups together and organize them has declined. But here, I think, is what got us to this point is everything we've done the last 10 years. My concern is that you have a new administration which has walked in. This isn't, and I don't mean to be partisan. Look, the terrorists don't care who runs the West Wing. They don't care if it's the right wing or the left wing of this country. They're just trying to kill us. But the president's basically made the argument, I've come to office and I've pretty much taken care of this terrorist thing, which is, one, not true. It's really everything we've done the last 10 years.
This is 9/11, 10 years after, from WMAL and the Museum, where history... This is 9/11, 10 years after, from WMAL and the Museum, where history lives. Here is Torie Clarke.
With us is James Carafano, Homeland Security expert, and he's also the director of the Center for Foreign Policy Studies at the Heritage Foundation. Now, how do you feel when you hear senior administration officials say we've pretty much won the war against Al-Qaeda?
Well, again, it's what they say is we, as if this administration walked into office and did everything right and everything before them was done wrong, which is exactly not true. It's what we've done the last 10 years as a nation that has made us successful. And it's actually where this administration has followed through on the policies of the administration before it, where they've been very successful. So it's not something they've done. It's something we as a nation have done. But the other thing they leave out of there is if we back off now, then we're just going to let the terrorists come back in the game. This would be like running a marathon and being ahead at mile 18 and just sitting down taking a nap and letting everybody catch up. Look, if we walk away from Afghanistan today, which essentially is what the president has outlined, the Taliban can come back in. They can create a space to operate. Al-Qaeda can have an opportunity to reconstitute, and they'll have the option of switching back and forth between Afghanistan and Pakistan. They can be much, much harder to kill. There are piece parts out there. I often describe this like the Terminator movies. Where you blow the Terminator apart and you think, oh, okay, it's the end of the movie, and then the pieces pull themselves back together and you're right back where you started.
Right.
That's the problem here is, Al-Qaeda's been greatly degraded, but you've got Al-Shabaab, you've got like Al-Taiber, you've got the Haqqani network, you have to have Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, you have Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, I mean, go on and on and on. These piece parts are dangerous of themselves, and if you leave Al-Qaeda alone to pull them back together as a global network, then you're right back where you started.
Right.
And then, by the way, we don't talk about the state sponsorship of terrorism that's coming out of Iran and what you could potentially be facing with Hamas and Hezbollah. So,
because if we talk about it, then we might have to deal with it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
we're going up.
I'm going to tell you,
Go ahead.
and I don't know if you've heard this, but people that I trust have told me that there is an active campaign in the administration to not have dissenting views on this. And if you don't buy the narrative that, we've won the war and we can ramp down now, then you're not needed any here. So Mike Leiter, was the head of the National Counterterrorism Center and very effective by all accounts, he left. And a lot of people tell me that he left because he wasn't on board with the new narrative. Mike Vickers, who's the senior intelligence guy in the Department of Defense, the word is he's leaving. And the word is for the same reason. So, Washington, I mean, everybody's got to answer about why people do things, but I'm hearing this a lot from a lot of people. Well,
another very real version of that is very senior people in the military, and there's nobody who's more careful about commitment of human beings than senior leaders in the military. Very worried about desire to get out of Iraq, get out of Afghanistan almost at any cost, and they just say all the gains we've made can slip back so quickly. I think there's real concern in the senior military about that.
Oh, I've heard that over and over again. I have not heard anybody. I have heard from so many people inside the Pentagon and from other places and who've been in the State Department, and to a person, they all say, look, this strategy going forward in Afghanistan is not driven by the facts on the ground. That this is taking huge risk, and Vice President Biden has been very influential in this, and it's this idea of the light footprint, which is basically we can use a sniper instead of an army, that we can stand off and we can use drones and some covert operations, and we can pick off these leaders, and that's all we need to do. It's kind of on the cheap. Well, look. The only reason why that's worked in Pakistan is because we've had this huge footprint in Afghanistan,
right? And
we had guys on the ground. So it's like how they're going to. I mean, first of all, they're going to do this in Yemen, and it's going to fail, right? I mean, without a footprint on the ground in Yemen, standing off from afar, they're never going to be able to kill their way out of this
right.
in Yemen.
Yeah.
So it's going to fail in Yemen, and now they're fixing to do the same thing in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And it's going to fail there. Yeah. And I really do fear. Look, I work in a nonpartisan foundation. I don't care who's president. I don't care who runs the Congress. I don't care who runs the country. I just care that the country is free, safe, and prosperous. And I don't say this for any other reason that I truly believe this. That if we follow the course that we've just set in the last few months with the new counterterrorism strategy and the announcement of the plan for Afghanistan, that in 2 years, we can be right back where we were on September 10th, 2001, in terms of the nature of the transnational terrorist threat.
No, I agree. And here's the last question for you, and it's maybe just an extension of what you're just talking about. I keep looking at this 10th anniversary of 9/11 and say, yes, people need to look back and reflect, and the loss of life was just extraordinary. but I think we should use it for some constructive purposes. If you could have people for 10 minutes focus on one thing on 9/11, what would you want them thinking about? What would you want them focused hardest on?
Well, I think the debate right now is really about getting your priorities straight. I mean, for example, you have people talking about $500 billion, $1 trillion in defense cuts. I mean, that's not practical. I mean, that's ridiculous.
Right.
And then you have a president who's come out and said, well, we have to cut defense because we have to preserve the things that are really important to this nation, like food stamps and throwing more money at education, even though we actually, as a nation, spend, if you add everything at the state and local, a lot more on education than we do on defense. I mean, this is unbelievably unrealistic things to be saying. Look, apparently Thomas Jefferson didn't say this, but he should have, that the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. And that is just so true.
Yeah.
I mean, Americans really need to get their act together and decide, where their real priorities are and what should the federal government really be doing for them. And we can delude ourselves with all kinds of notions about, there's all this fraud, waste, and abuse in the Pentagon but at the end of the day, it's men and women that are our children who put on uniforms and go out and fight for us, and also people in the CIA and law enforcement and cops and everything else. And they are the root of our liberty. I think that's worth remembering.
Having the right priorities.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. When we got Osama bin Laden, does Barack Obama get more credit for that than he deserves? Does George Bush get less credit than he deserves?
No, I mean, look, the nation should get all the credit. And again, the reason why we got Osama bin Laden is because all right, let me try that again. Well, no, I think the nation should get the credit. And the reason we got Osama bin Laden is because we hounded him to earth for 10 years, because we had a presence in Afghanistan, because we were engaged in Pakistan, because we did these worldwide operations. It's not, I mean, I love SEAL Team 6, but SEAL Team 6 is no more responsible for getting Osama bin Laden than the guys who raised the flag on Iwo Jima were responsible for winning World War II.
Right.
They were a symbol. They were the cutting edge. But it's everything we did as a nation over 10 years that got us to that point, not a decision made by the president, not a bunch of people sitting in a room looking at a monitor that apparently wasn't showing anything. It was us as a nation. So can I just give you 10 seconds on what we should not be doing?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think here's something we can really learn is we've been doing this business for 10 years. One of the things that we've learned a lot about is what we need to stop doing that's stupid. And I'll give you a good example. Homeland Security grants have been a waste. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars a year giving grants to small fire departments in the name of Homeland Security. And you look at the analysis, it shows the departments that get those grants, not only have they not had any terrorist attacks, but their people aren't any safer. They don't have any more accidents. They don't have any more or less fires. Hundreds of millions of dollars on these things, tens of billions of dollars. Most of it's really not accomplished anything. And in most cases, what's happened is we've given a bunch of money to the states, and if they were spending $1, what they did is they started spending 50 cents and then using 50 cents of the government money. So that's a huge waste. We've put stupid security requirements out there that we know haven't accomplished anything. There was a requirement to put 100% scanning of all containers coming in the United States, which was a dumb idea because that's not how terrorists would send things here. But that point aside, here we are 6 years later, and the Secretary of Homeland Security, who's a Democrat, and the bill was pushed through by Democrats, and she said this is an unworkable and stupid idea. We have 100% interview for everybody that gets a visa to come to the United States, even though we know that that's stupid and doesn't really accomplish anything. We spend all this money on airport security, and airport security actually isn't that much better now than it was on September 10th. So, I mean, we spend an awful lot of money on an awful lot of things that really aren't doing much, and we could stop doing that. And at the same time, we have other parts of Homeland Security which are being starved. I mean, the Coast Guard, which is a big part of this, they've got ships that are eligible for Social Security. And here you have a Congress which is cutting off funding for replacing the ships so they can put more money into grants for local fire departments. I mean, I love local fire departments. I'm all for it. But they need to be funded by the people in the communities, not by the taxpayer.
Yeah, I think your perspective is dead on. James Carafano, thank you so much. Just incredible work, incredibly thoughtful, important work, and thanks for talking with us.
Thanks for having me.
This is 9/11, 10 years after, from WMAL and the Museum, where history